Hello, and welcome to Cabinet Conversations. I'm Teela Foxworth, Director of Equity, Diversity, Inclusion at Ford's Theater. If you are joining us for the first time, this is our live series exploring creativity, history, and leadership. You can learn more about Cabinet Conversations and explore our past programs at our website, www.fords.org. We're hearing from our students, our visitors, and our neighbors that we feel really divided right now. It feels like there's a rise in binary mentality. You're either with us or against us, and there's no gray area or room for nuance. Ford's Theater is proud to be a nonpartisan organization, and it's our privilege to welcome folks from all across the political spectrum to our site and to our programs. Today, we are tackling cultural and political tension and how to bridge the divide. Please join me in welcoming our panelists, Paul Brathwaite, Psalmayene 24, and Ritu Radhakrishnan to the conversation. Paul Brathwaite is a chief strategist at Federal Street Strategies, bringing over 2 decades of government experience to clients in financial services, healthcare, media and telecommunications, and the education and nonprofit fields. Prior to joining the private sector, Paul spent 6 years as executive director of the Congressional Black Caucus, was a deputy assistant secretary at the Department of Labor, and started his career in the General Counsel's Honors Program at the Department of Transportation. Paul has received numerous awards, including the Washington Government Relations Group Lobbyist of the Year Award, the Hill's Top Lobbyist list for 6 years running, and he was selected a number of times to Roll Call's Fabulous 50 Staffers on Capitol Hill. Welcome, Paul. Psalmayene 24 is an award-winning playwright, director, and actor, and is currently the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation Playwright in Residence at the Mosaic Theater Company here in Washington, D.C. Playwriting credits include Monumental Travesties, Dear Maple, and Les Deux Noirs at Mosaic Theater Company, Out of the Vineyard at Joe's Movement Emporium, An Eloquent Fugitive Slave Flees to Ireland at Solus Nua, Free Jujubee Brown at the African Community Theater Company, and Zomo the Rabbit, a hip-hop creation myth at Imagination Stage. Directing credits include Metamorphoses at Folger Theater that just closed, Tempestuous Elements at Arena Stage, Good Bones Flow and Passover at Studio Theater, and Necessary Senses, a radio play at Ford's Theater. His solo play, Free Jujubee Brown, is recognized as a seminal piece in hip-hop theater. He is a recipient of a Helen Hayes Award for Outstanding Direction of a play and has received the Imagination Award from Imagination Stage. Welcome, Psalm.
Thank you for having me.
Lastly, we have Ritu Radhakrishnan, who is a department chair and associate professor in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at the State University of New York at Oswego. She is the coordinator of the Adolescent Social Studies Education Program and teaches courses in literacy, curriculum studies, culturally relevant teaching, pedagogy, social justice, and elementary and adolescent social studies methods. She also serves as the chair of the School of Education's Diversity Committee and is the incoming chair of Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity Subcommittee of SUNY UFS. She is a member of the iCivics Teacher Network and the Independent Review Council for iCivics. Her research focuses on incorporating critical pedagogy and aesthetics in social studies curriculum. Specifically, she examines how the integration of aesthetic practices, including children's and young adult literature in social studies curricula, affects student engagement, voice, and agency. Welcome, Ritu. So as a reminder to all of our viewers that are tuning in, we are taking questions on our social media platforms. So please feel free to submit those questions and we may share them in the course of our conversation with our guests during the program. Let's just start off and begin with getting each of you all to kind of share your perspective and describe from your own experience, what is the state of public discourse right now and how did we get here? Paul, if we can start with you and then we'll go to Ritu and then to Psalm.
Thank you, Teela, and thank you for having me on today. You know, the state of our discourse isn't very good right now. I mean, some folks would characterize it as not very pleasant. And, you know, how we got here, I think, has really been because we aren't listening to each other. We all have our own opinions, but we're not lending ourselves to stop and listen. And if you don't listen, you really can't hear the other person. You are so set in your way that you, whatever they say, you essentially are bypassing, and you think you almost assume what you think they're going to say, and you already have a response back before they even open their mouth. And so my view is, if we stop and listen to one another a little bit more, we actually probably could actually hear what people are saying versus assuming what they're saying to us or what their point of view might be.
Thank you, Paul. I think that is a very key thing right now, is that we're not taught how to listen to each other, or at least listen with compassion. Ritu, do you want to share your perspective?
Yeah, from a higher education lens, I think part of it is a result of the pandemic. You know, people were stuck behind a computer. There wasn't a lot of interaction. So those formative years, particularly adolescence and early adolescence, people weren't learning how to engage. They weren't learning how, and people were trying to survive. Particularly many under-resourced communities just didn't have resources to survive. So everything else kind of got pushed to the wayside. And I think one of the things we're reevaluating at higher education is what people need. There's not the same need for coming out with the BA. You know, there's so many opportunities to be successful and to engage and make money in different ways. And so a lot of times we're not getting sort of that foundational liberal arts education where students are learning to engage in civil discourse, to evaluate sources, to recognize what an argument is. And we're not doing that. And so one of the things we're doing at the SUNY system is to look at that, to look at what are the general education requirements as students come into schools, and really think about what students need to be, you know, civic minded and socially responsible as they leave institutions of higher learning.
Thank you so much, Ritu. Psalm?
Yeah, we're more polarized than I can ever remember as a society, where everything seems to operate in this binary system of, you know, black, white, you know, red, blue, Beyonce or Taylor Swift, Kendrick or Drake. Like, I mean, right through pop culture, you see the same sort of framing of this or that. And then in terms of like communities that communicate, it seems like there's a lot of groups that operate in echo chambers. So there's no diversity, or there tends to be, you know, little diversity of thought even within communities. I think it's harder and harder these days to really, you know, even think outside of your own community. There tends to be backlash sometimes. So where things are right now, I mean, they seem to be pretty dire, to be perfectly honest with you. And how we got here, I mean, man, from historical circumstances, political, sociological, I mean, a lot of things play a role. Ritu mentioned the pandemic, which, I mean, we can't really overstate how significant that was in terms of every aspect of life. But really, you know, with politics and people sometimes really leaning into a polarized sort of environment and really trying to take advantage of that, that seems to be a trend and seems to be something that's also happening.
Yeah. Thank you all. And I really, you know, from Paul's perspective of we're not listening to each other, and Ritu about re-looking at curriculum because students need different skills for this time. And then Psalm, I really loved what you just said. You took us through the art world politics of how we are just binary in our thinking. So thank you for setting the stage of kind of more of these things that we're going to dig into. My next question that I also want to pose to all of you is, what do people feel like is at stake if they're in disagreement with somebody? Like, why can't we be okay with just disagreeing anymore? Ritu, we'll start with you, then we'll go to Psalm, and we'll end with Paul.
Yeah, thank you. It's funny that you brought up Kendrick and Drake, because as someone on the outside, it is permeating every single algorithm, and I still don't know what happened, but it's what I did love was like people are breaking down evidence by evidence, how one claim was attacked and there was a counter argument. Like, it was beautifully done in terms of looking for evidence and demonstrating a counter argument and providing a different perspective. But as someone on the outside, I still don't know what exactly happened. And I don't know what the disagreement is. And I think that's kind of what happens. The disagreement becomes so large. In politics, particularly, taking away from being an outsider of Kendrick and Drake, but a lot of times it becomes so personal in politics, and it is. The personal is political, and it feels like a part of you is being attacked when you're restructuring or trying to recorrect or saying, that's actually a microaggression. And then you have people saying, well, you're making things up, you're sensitive and you're fragile. No, if it hurts someone, it hurts someone. And this is the way we're trying to change the course, how we're trying to change discourse. And in the beginning, it wasn't about, attacking each other. It was about saying, this has been historically hurtful. This is culturally hurtful. And now it's become sort of a badge of honor to not honor someone's gender and to not honor someone's culture. And that's where I think we're getting a little lost in the weeds, and we need to come back to basic understanding. And that's where it's lost. And I don't know, what's contributed to that. And I think it's a multitude of things in terms of, the 24-hour news cycle, social media. There's just a lot of opportunities for people to go viral, and it takes the place of reasonable discussions.
Absolutely. And Ritu, at another time, I can give you the whole Kendrick Drake breakdown, but I don't think we can cover it right now. Psalm, do you want to answer that question about why we can't be okay with just disagreeing anymore, and what's at stake in that disagreement?
Yeah, I think there are times when people feel like who they are is at stake. Their very identity is tethered to their point of view in a way that is not constructive, at least in terms of dialogue and civil conversation. So they really, I do think that some people feel like if an idea that they have is challenged, and even if they change how they think about something, then that's compromising who they are on some deep fundamental level. And I think there's a fear of changing, and there's a fear of becoming something else than what they've used to be, or becoming something other than what they think they actually are. So I think that's really what's at stake when people are adverse to sort of changing their frames of thinking.
Thank you for that. And I do think that idea of just change, it's scary. You don't know it. It's the unknown. So I think that is really a key there. Paul, what are your thoughts?
A couple of things. I'm not sure we're all operating on the same set of facts. Everyone gets their information from different places. And so you walk into a conversation saying, well, what I've seen and read and believe and now believe, those are the facts, when they could be so off from the facts that it's difficult to have a conversation. And so you can't agree, you can't be comfortable disagreeing, or you can't be comfortable being wrong because you believe what you've been told or seen and read is what the set of facts are. So we're not operating from the same set of facts. Everybody's getting their information from different places. So that's one. We used to have both local and national news networks. A lot of those have sort of, and local newspapers, national newspapers, a lot of closure there. And so whether you're talking about politics or sports or music or arts or whatever, folks are getting their information from different sources, and there's no control where we all say, or at least a place where we all say, you know what, that's one place where we can go for, nonpartisan, information and have a discussion. I think the other part is like, there used to be a maturity and there used to be grownups in the room. There used to be, look, I can't just be petty and I've got to sort of go to the next step, because what are we actually teaching our children? If the adults are acting like this, when our children do the same thing and act the same way, we ask a question, well, where did they learn that from? If you put a mirror in front of your face, I think we know where they learn that from. And that leads to folks then saying, well, I can't be your friend if you have that view and I have that view. We're just going to have to go our separate ways, versus us saying, let's agree to disagree and move on to the next topic or next experience or what have you. We'd rather just seemingly walk away. And at some point, we've got to figure out, rather than, I've stated the problem very well, but what's the solution to it? I mean, everyone can state the problem, but who's actually going to tell us the path forward or show us the path forward? And I think that just takes leadership and, again, a maturity that we all have to strive and get to, and we're all guilty of. But if we have that sort of as our North Star, I think it will benefit us in the long run.
Thank you, Paul. And actually, that's a great segue for my next question to Ritu. As an educator, we're taught certain things, and how we communicate is a learned and practiced skill. So my question for you is, how does the way that we teach inform and influence people and how they converse and or engage with the world?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I was thinking about that this morning. It just feels like teachers are more and more either frightened to do things, or there've been a set of restrictions imposed upon them. And so the instances that allowed for teachers to explore discussions, to explore dialogues, to explore multiple perspectives are being cut out over and over, whether it's banning books, whether it's removing curricula, whether it's board members who have not been in a classroom coming in and saying, you can't teach my kid this. Even school vouchers, I think, are a threat right now to these discussions, as we take the money meant for public schools and give it to private schools. We're doing a disservice to the culture that was the foundation of Dewey's premise of education in public schools. So, teachers don't have time to teach that. They're meeting assessments, they're getting test scores up, they're filling out, there's so much paperwork these days that there's not the space to teach how to civically engage and how to actually think about arguments. And as Paul was saying, hear what you're saying. I hear you, I don't agree, but this is the next step, or this is the next purpose. And again, it's being modeled in a way that we're seeing people yelling at each other in Congress, in news cycles and social media, and it's very difficult to compete with that. It's very difficult to compete with the phone that's showing you one way of acting and the other way of acting that will ensure deeper thinking and critical thinking and questioning.
Yeah, absolutely. And Ritu, I really like the what you said about just teachers being under an immense amount of pressure. And it's, nationally, but then our states and our districts and all of those people have different agendas. And it's just very hard to be a teacher right now. So shout out to all of our educators out there. We see you. Saul, my next question is for you. Much of your work illuminates differing perspectives of different people and different groups and identities. Can you describe how your work as a playwright and director addresses or speaks to current issues in public discourse?
Sure. Well, I'll start by saying as a theater maker, I love moving toward lightning as opposed to away from it, where the natural human instinct is actually to maybe move away from a polarizing issue. I think it's interesting when we create art around an issue that some may look at as divisive, because then you get people with different perspectives in the same room. And that's exciting to me. There's an electricity that can be created, and an opportunity to actually build some sort of bridge or connection that really excites me. But in terms of the specific work that I create, I wrote a play called Monumental Travesties, and that play centered the Emancipation Memorial, which is a monument that features Abraham Lincoln, who's standing over a kneeling Black man in a loincloth. Now, the monument is supposed to commemorate emancipation. I had a very visceral, personal response to it. So it filled me with disdain when I first saw it. And as a means of trying to alchemize my own personal feelings, I wrote this play, which is a comedy, actually, as a way of sort of working through not only my own feelings, but really trying to step into the mind of people who have a different perspective about the monument than I do. So there's a curiosity that I sort of brought to that project that also infuses my work. When that play was produced over at Mosaic Theater Company, Mosaic hosted a series of discussions, part of a reflection series, a series of conversations that happened at different locations. We actually had a conversation at the monument, and we had people with different perspectives there in conversation, talking about the monument, talking about its history, talking about what could potentially be done. Did we come up with any solutions necessarily? No, but I think there was the spirit of seeing each other, spirit of respect, and a spirit of humanity that I think was a big part of sort of the outcome and the fruits of what that project and what my work is all about. So yeah, just thinking about different themes and issues that are in the public conversation and then are part of the zeitgeist. That's a part of what my work is certainly entrenched in.
Thank you, Psalm. I really love the idea that you brought everybody to the site of the statue and you could talk across perspective. Like, that is community engagement. And the goal is not always to leave feeling the same as everyone, but to just be elevated at another level and to understand across perspective. So thank you for that. Paul, my next question is for you. Our society seems to engage in debate rather than dialogue. And we're defining debate as persuasive speaking, where you're trying to change someone's mind, versus a dialogue, which is an open exchange of ideas for the sake of learning. So in working in the political sphere, how do you set the groundwork for compromise in a society that seems obsessed with winning?
Well, I learned and started sort of as a guidepost when I started this work that, there was nothing that we would need to be working on where we would be having an argument, such that we would raise our voices or leave a conversation mad with one another. Again, not saying that your approach or the person's approach that you're talking to would be what you would adopt, but we would talk it through such that when we left, we could either shake hands or say we'll follow up tomorrow or whatever. Because in this work, the same people you work with today may be the same people you see in 10, 15 years, and you don't want that experience to be the one where I was talking to Teela. We were angry about some issue we were working on in healthcare, and now when she's the chief strategy officer at the Department of Health and Human Services, I can't have a conversation with her because of how we left that last conversation. That's not what I want to have happen. The other approach, I think, the way I look at this work is, in having a dialogue, is we need to be able to take half a loaf versus no loaf. And while that's a cliche, and my mom always tells me don't use cliches, I think it's a good one. You'd rather have half a loaf of bread than no loaf of bread, because your breakfast won't be too good if you don't have any bread or toast with it. And so we make incremental progress. Lots of folks say, well, we need to solve this problem today. Well, no problem is ever solved today. We always have to go back and revisit it and figure out how we improve on it. And it's much easier to improve by going from 50 to 100 than 0 to 100. And so whatever area we're talking about, healthcare, education, transportation, energy policy, foreign policy, let us start off by saying we are trying to make progress, and that progress requires us to have a dialogue and to figure out where we meet in an agreement, and then we build off of it the next week, the next month, the next year. And that's how I've tried to adjust in my work and my approach to different things. Is one, again, well, let's not leave this conversation in such a state that we can't pick it up again and figure out how we keep building off of it. And then if we do reach agreement and we've gotten to a point where we agree on 60 or 70%, we take that deal and then we say, let's come back and work on the next 30 or 40% to get us closer to, hopefully addressing the problem, if not solving the problem.
Thank you, Paul. I really appreciated what you said at the top of that answer as far as, thinking ahead, whether am I just trying to win the discussion or the debate, or am I looking at the long term of the potential of the relationship, whether that's a work relationship, if that's a friendship of the future. We're just looking very close to, I think, the event instead of years down the line. So I appreciate that perspective. Psalm, you already started to talk about this, but I'm going to pose a question to Ritu and yourself. And Ritu, you can start us off. But in your opinion, what role does the arts play in fostering dialogue and understanding in our society?
Well, I think Psalm said it well. I really like the idea of there's a tension, there's an electricity when you start bringing in perspectives that hadn't been explored yet. And so particularly in social studies curriculum, there isn't a lot of that. There might be a painting in a textbook. There might be, actually, that's about it. There might be a painting. But so I try to explore, what has music of that time said? What has theater of the time said? What is poetry of the time said? Because artists are saying something political. And if they claim they're not political, that's political too, right? Toni Morrison talked about how they're just repeating the status quo. And so it's always going to be political. An artist always has something to say and a voice that needs to be heard. And theoretically, we have evidence that there's a cognition to it, that there's a developing thought process that children engage in when they're engaged in art. And so if they're able to start that critical thinking, if they're able to develop those patterns of cognition and understanding, and then that can lead to that, that oral proficiency, that developing that dialogue. And art gives you those opportunities. It's the one place where critique is encouraged, where thoughts are encouraged, where people don't get, it is hurtful sometimes. I know artists do feel that because their art is their art, it's them. But people's feedback is always encouraged, and it's the one place where you can have an opinion, and that's okay. And that opinion is disagreed upon, and then people just leave. And it's the one place where what Paul is talking about is okay. And so if we start doing that earlier with students, we've noticed there's a trend. For those people who are worried about evaluation and assessment, we've noticed an increase in test scores, but we've also noticed an increase in students' ability to argue, to develop ideas, to think critically, to move to higher order synthesis and creativity, and work through this understanding. And so the way that art is reflected in a curriculum often tells us what adults think about it. So when it's cut, when it's one of the first budgets to be cut, we know that people don't understand the importance of it, and they don't understand what students can actually get from it.
Absolutely. Thank you. Psalm, do you have anything to add to that? I know your last answer started to touch on this, but if you had anything else you wanted to say?
Yeah, no, that was beautifully stated. I'll talk from the perspective of a theater maker. Theaters are laboratories where people can, get into a safe environment, hopefully, right? And vicariously live through these characters. You see these characters on stage and they're essentially avatars for the audience members. And you hopefully with good theater, you see some sort of clash of ideas and clash of perspective. I mean, that's what drama is. People who want either the same thing or different things, and they're in conflict with each other. It's all about conflict. So you really get a chance to not only see it, but then depending on the theater and the performance, you might have an opportunity to then talk about the themes and talk about the ideas of the play. And that really gives us a unique opportunity to sort of test out things that maybe, you know, things that are deep inside of us that maybe we don't feel comfortable sharing in a public setting. So I think the value of art is really giving people that sort of outlet and letting them see other people, you know, really get into it. You might see, you know, people might get killed on stage. I mean, of course, we don't want to do that, but, you know, you get a chance to actually see sort of how this train, like where will this train actually go if we carry it to its logical conclusion? And I think that's very important in society and culture at large.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much for that, those responses, which also is a nice segue into our next question that I'm going to pose to all of you. You know, I'm hearing a lot right now, and I think you probably all are no exception, that this is the most divided we've ever been. But that simply isn't true. You know, our nation has went through a civil war, and we know it's been worse, but there's this feeling that it is the worst it's ever been. So Lincoln was a master of the art of compromise. What lessons do you think that we could take from Lincoln and apply them to today about how to promote unity in this age of division? And we'll start with Paul, and then we'll go to Ritu and then Psalm.
Well, one is, I think, Teela, you know, Doris Kearns Goodwin's book of Team of Rivals, of where the president, the former president, brought his rivals closer to him rather than keeping them apart in recent memory. And again, when people say in our lifetime the worst it's been, is because we didn't live through the Civil War. So we really can only speak to it from having read and seen and not understood that, you know, when our country was literally at war with one another, cannot be what we would now say today that we are, you know, either literally or figuratively. But, you know, former President Obama brought Hillary Clinton, his chief opponent in 2008, into his cabinet and made her Secretary of State, which arguably is one of the most prominent positions in his administration. And one could have thought that would have been unheard of bringing your opponent into your cabinet. But the president saw a benefit in doing so. And I think you can draw lessons from President Lincoln having done the same in his cabinet, you know, over 100 and some odd years ago, as again, a way of, again, bringing people to the table. It was always the case that you had, you know, one member of the opposing party in your cabinet, and you would give that person some cabinet position or what have you. But, you know, the leadership of our country, the president, the speaker, the majority leader, the respective leaders of the minority parties, they have to rise to a level to show not only our country, but the world, that we can function properly. It used to be that we said, you know, our conflict stopped at the water's edge and we were all for America. You know, some folks might question that today, whether it's, you know, whether or not you're for America or whether you're for yourself or for some other, you know, entity or thing that doesn't necessarily put the country first. And I think what we saw from our leaders, President Lincoln put the country first. I mean, they used the quote, you know, a house divided cannot will fall or won't succeed. They sought to use that against him, but he basically was saying, like, look, we can't be on different sides as a union in order for it to succeed. And I think we have to understand that that is indeed the case.
Thank you, Paul. We're going to pass it over to Ritu.
I think kind of to piggyback on that, it was about the greater good of the country. And I have been really critical of Lincoln and the way Lincoln has been represented in the curricula, because ultimately he did want to uphold a lot of white supremacist ideas. But at the end of the day, the country was strengthened by him signing the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, it didn't end slavery, and that's one of the things that's problematic in textbooks, is that we're not giving the whole story. We're not giving the truth completely. And I had a wonderful U.S. history teacher who brought in alternative narratives, and where I was able to see early on that, oh, there's more to this story. And to look at the dilemma, like the dilemma that presidencies go through, the dilemma that people in leadership positions go through. What is the greater good? And one thing I do think that he did was think about the greater good of the country, that there needed to be the states together. And to do that, he went against everything he believed in, which is, I still don't know if I could do that, but in the end it worked out. But I don't know if someone asked me to act the other way, if I could do that. That's a huge ask, but it did benefit the country at the time, and I'm sure it wasn't easy, as we know, it didn't end well. So, but I think that ultimately we have to know the whole story. We have to know the whole context, and we do a disservice, romanticizing the history without giving the full, because that makes it so much more real when you learn about his independent morals versus what the country was doing. And I think Obama is a great example too. He talked about the tensions within his own family and the tensions with his grandmother and his pastor. And, I think we have to talk about those tensions. Everything's not going to be perfect. And articulating the tensions is the way that those connections are made.
Thank you. And I really love what you just said. It reminds me of Clint Smith's book, How the Word is Passed, that we have this blurred of like these lines of what was factual history and what's nostalgia for history. So there's almost like we like the stories of the hero, but then we don't actually cut beneath the surface of all of the strife that was there. And I really like that you notated that. Thank you. And Psalm, if you'd like to take a stab at this question, if you need a little refresher, I can repeat it. So what lessons from Lincoln can we apply now to promote unity in this age of division?
Yeah, I think Lincoln, the same things that I like about Lincoln are the same things that I'm critical of. This ability to seemingly walk a mile in someone else's moccasins or see another perspective. Was it just political wizardry? What exactly was going on here? I'm not exactly clear, but I know he got some very important things done. So I think this sort of makes me think of what Paul said about taking the half loaf of bread as opposed to no bread. Like sometimes you have to sort of figure things out and do what you think are best, if not for yourself, for the good of the country. So I think that's a lesson that I really take from Lincoln is thinking about the long game and not really thinking short term, which I think he was actually pretty good at.
Yeah. Thank you. And Ritu, I kind of have a follow-up question for you because you're with students and because of where they are in their life right now, this probably is the most divided time that they've ever experienced. So what are you hearing from them, if anything? Like, how is this showing up in their lives and their discourse?
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of the students who want to become social studies teachers do so because they fell in love with the American story. They fell in love with the World War II histories, and the way it articulated, compassion, empathy, heroism. So a lot of times that's what they're going to see themselves teaching. And that's not the end of the story. The curriculum tries to expand from early ages to what they like to say is the late 1900s and makes me realize it was when I was in high school. So that scares me a little bit. So, but I mean, that was the Cold War, right? So that's what they see. And they're seeing it as a distance. And some of the tension is that they don't know how to teach it. In the last year, we've seen civic scores lower because no one's quite sure what the Constitution actually said anymore. Like, we can talk about the Bill of Rights, but it's not actually playing out the way it's supposed to play out, the way we were taught it was to play out, the way that we learned about the Supreme Court cases. Things have changed. The narrative has shifted. And, things that we thought were written in stone are no longer. They're being kind of chiseled away. And so there's a lot of confusion on the part of would-be teachers, because you see people going viral. You don't want to get fired in your first year. You want to make sure that you're teaching students how to learn, but you also want to impart that passion of history to them too. And so it's sometimes safer to go by the textbooks instead of bringing in, those people that really inspired you. And so there's a fear. And one of the things I do tell them is, don't get fired in your first year. Learn how to teach first, learn the basics. And then you can think about how you want to teach students to think critically. You don't want to, the idea, and, which is where we get kind of confused. The idea is to not, indoctrinate anyone. The idea is to get students who are critical thinkers. And so that's a bit of a confusion right now about how do we do that and still keep our job and pay for food and make it to the next day.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that kind of, inside track of what an educator is also thinking, like, how do I do this? Because it is a really hard task, and don't get fired. My next question is for all of you, and we'll go to Paul first and then Psalm, and then we'll end with Ritu. Can you all share examples or approaches that you've taken to unite people, to bring them together in order to exchange different points of view?
I am a part of a group, Teela, called Center Forward, and it's a foundation or an organization that was started on the premise that anything they do, they have to have one Democrat or one Republican as a part of it, whether it's a staff conversation or a member conversation. So it takes us out of our silos, right? And you aren't just talking to one group or one political party. You have them sitting together and trying to figure out how we're going to move a problem forward. I found it fascinating because in addition to having both a member from each party, you also have the folks who are there, Democrats and Republicans, all in the same room, and trying to zero in on opportunities to move forward. I think just the basic premise of saying, whenever we invite a forum or we put a forum together, we will invite someone from the other party. I think it just helps the dialogue and forces the conversation and it forces people out of their talking points. So you can't just come in with a set of points that you want to make because you're going to be challenged, and you have to go a little deeper than just the sound bites.
Absolutely. And I like the representation at the table. You've got to have a seat at the table first, and then we can engage in that discourse.
That's right.
Psalm, did you want to answer that question for us too? Thank you.
Sure. With me, it really it centers on the types of plays that I write and the types of subject matter that I am gravitated toward. Right now, I'm in the early stages of a musical about Marion Barry. And we know that this is a man who elicits, a wide range of responses, and a lot of them are passionate on, the far end of the spectrum. Subject matter like, Barry, that's a very deliberate choice. I want to bring people together who, have opposing perspectives on a person or an idea or a theme and things like that. So it's really baked into my practice as an artist.
Wonderful. It sounds like it. It sounds like you do a lot of cool programming around your art, which I think is always great to just have people think deeper and be brought together to talk across perspective. Ritu, did you have anything to add?
For me, I work with a lot of young adult and children's literature books. So bringing that into the classroom, first of all, my students are still young adults and they're going to be teaching young adults. So finding what they need to know to connect to their students is the best way that I could find. Now there are a lot more historical reviews. So, Ibram Kendi Stamped was made into a young adult book and a graphic novel for readers who need a little more support. There's Indigenous Peoples History by Debbie Reese. There's multicultural history with most of the Asian immigration experience. So there are more ways to find representation today. So, one of the things I do is have them read those books and find out how a historical experience may be different in a different community. How may, not just the hunter's view, but the lion's perspective too. What are you seeing? And in addition to that, there's a whole range of diverse books now in young adult literature, and so many authors who are bringing different stories and different experiences that we haven't seen before. A lot of times they're getting banned, but the good thing about that is when they're banned, we know about them more, and the Brooklyn Public Library is offering them free. So there's a barcode for students to get those books. So to get these experiences into the hands of the younger generation is one of the most important things I can see.
Wonderful. And you're right. There's so many more stories across perspective than even when I was growing up, and which is wonderful to always see. I want to go back to something that, Paul, you said in the very first response today, and it's all about listening. And I'm going to pose this to all of you, and we'll start with Psalm. How can people engage in better listening behaviors? How can we think about not necessarily responding, but listening and absorbing what somebody else has to say?
That's such a great question. I think part of it is surrendering to the present moment and not being caught up in the past or not being caught up in the future. And that's something that's difficult to do. This is not an easy task to actually listen and be present. And then I think there's also the ingredient of a willingness to change if you're presented with evidence that goes against what you believe. So I think that's sort of the two-pronged approach that I'll have.
And Paul, we'll go to you next. Thank you, Psalm.
I often try to think through, is it almost the case that we might need to have people repeat what we say in order for them to actually listen? Like if you forced people to repeat, did you hear what I just shared with you in terms of my approach on this? If so, just repeat it back to me so we can at least say we're operating from the same set of facts. I mentioned again, we all have our come into the conversations usually with our own set of facts versus one set of operating. But again, I really do try, and maybe it's because I'm married to a woman who says, all right, I need you to listen to me because I want to make sure we know what we're doing moving forward, that I take that into my work. And again, if we practice some of these things at home, you will then actually understand how to do it when you're out in the professional setting as well. I mean, my parents always used to say, training starts at home, and then we go out and we exhibit those behaviors as we engage in our personal and professional lives. And I try to emulate those in my work and with my colleagues in the same way. I mean, we're in the client service business, and so hearing and understanding what the client is saying is quite important in terms of the work that we do. And so again, we end up practicing it in lots of different ways with lots of different clients across disciplines.
Absolutely. And Paul, I love what you just said about we can practice these behaviors in our homes and, in our circles, in our community, and then they'll also have a great benefit in the world, in our workplaces. Ritu, did you have any tips on how to be a better listener?
Yeah, I think Paul said it earlier about operating on the same set of facts, and we have to make sure that they're the correct facts. I think they're the term alternate facts was introduced a few years ago, and it's something that one of the things I like to teach my students and to make sure that we're all practicing is looking at the evidence, looking at the sources, finding the sources that are valid. And so I can't remember what organization it is, but they did a great infographic about all the media sources and where they are across the spectrum. And so, the only sources that I will allow in the class, and not even, some of the ones that are CNN or MSN, it's got to be the ones that are straight center if we're providing evidence. If you're providing a fact, I need to see that the fact was replicated, that the source was acknowledged, the source was vetted, that those practices were there. If you're writing a historical paper, I need to know where that information came from, because there are going to be different interpretations of history, and that's fine. But the primary document and then the secondary source are going to tell you different things, and you need to be able to differentiate between that. And so once students are able to do that and to understand that that's important, we're contending with AI these days and ChatGPT, and making sure that they're able to be able to create their own understanding. And that's one of our worries, that they're not hearing. And when it's important, I actually put a little cell phone on the bottom that says, take a picture of me. So it's in your phone, take a picture of this. It's important. Take this home and make sure it's with you next week. So making sure that there are ways, if it's, asking someone, okay, did you hear what I said? Can you repeat it back to me? Or making sure it's in their hands. But as many times as you need to say it to make sure that that's heard, and that we're operating on the same set of facts, because I think that's where a lot of the misinformation comes from.
Absolutely. And I think as well as primary and secondary sources and helping them discern that. I used to be an educator and I used to teach public speaking. And I realized maybe 4 or 5 years into my career that we teach people how to speak, but we don't ever really teach them how to listen. And so that's probably something that we should be better about, in our formal education, is how do I listen, and seeking to understand rather to be understood. I have one more question I'm going to pose to all of our panelists before I let you all go. A little bit of hope, hopefully, for the future. But if we're looking 50 years from now and people are looking back on the 2020s, what do you think will be the major themes that come up, major highlights or events? And most importantly, what are the moments of unification? And we'll start with Psalm, and then we'll go to Ritu, and we'll end with Paul.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I think about is obviously the pandemic, but then the killing of George Floyd. I mean, that, just the ripples that created, across the world and across different groups of people, just staggering and mind-blowing. And we're still feeling those ripples now, out of that tragedy. I think there's actually been lots of opportunities to actually bring people together. But for me, that's right at the top.
Thank you. Ritu?
For me, I do want to put a bit of hope out. It's that student activism. Our students are engaged. They're excited about making changes. And I don't just mean our students, our younger generation. After George Floyd's murder, I think in 64 countries, there were murals of George Floyd that went up. And, trying to engage the arts with this is that there are voices out there. I see the way that students protested this spring, and that it's still going on. I do think that when people look back, they're going to see the student activism engaged, and they're going to see that they want a better world and they want a safer world for everyone. And I think we're going through that tension, but I think it's going to come out okay. The kids are good. They're excited. They're learning. They want to spread hope, and I think they are.
Thank you. And finally, Paul, any inspiration?
Yeah, I don't. I mean, I think we have made it through the pandemic, although we still have remnants of these variants that keep popping up. But I just do think that, for 3, 4 years of our lives were sort of put on pause. I'm not sure, had the pandemic not happened, whether or not we would have thought that this was that this was possible for us to do this virtually. We would have probably all come to Ford's Theater, sat on a stage, tried to build an audience, versus recording this, having 4 boxes on a screen. We all might have said, that sounds weird and crazy. Like, why wouldn't we be in person? But I also do think like that has now introduced us into not necessarily seeing each other in person, face to face. It's a little more difficult for me to say something to you, Teela, Ritu, and Sam, if I'm standing right in front of you and I've got to look you in the eye and I've got to answer your question, or we're having a conversation. It's a lot different than when I'm behind a camera on a screen. I'm willing to say anything. I can move my hands. I probably wouldn't do that in front of you, because you'd all probably say, "Hey, we need our space here. Let's make sure we have some spatial 6 feet, 3 feet, whatever it might be." All of which was introduced where? In the pandemic, right? So that'll be a takeaway. I think the fact that we have come through it, that we helped our neighbors, we helped family members in ways that, I think parents helping children, children helping their parents. Adults helping their older parents through that time. In some instances, helped bring us closer together as families than we might have all done had there not been a need, or ordering groceries. I think there's still an instance where, again, folks are continuing to order groceries for their family members, whereas we would have never thought about doing that, or even thought about of it being possible, but for that occurrence. I mean, from the hope side, you see glimmers of hope almost every day, and some newspapers and publications do try to figure out a way to pull out, here's one good thing I saw today. They do it in sports, they do it in the news, they do it in politics. Things that might not get covered because they're not controversial. Controversy, viral moments all go and get the headlines and the front pages of newspapers, whereas the small acts of good deeds sometimes go unnoticed, but there are more and more people who are trying to pull those out. Local radio, local news play a role in all of that. And the more we have of that, I think, the better off we are. Conversations like the one that Ford's Theater is having today about community creating across the divide. It takes a lot of work for you, Teela, and your colleagues to say, you know what, we're not going to just state the problem. We're going to actually try to bring folks together to have a conversation. I mean, that gives me a lot of hope. And I think it should give all of us a lot of hope that the more conversations that we have like this on college campuses and in the arts, on virtual, in the virtual space, I think is all to our benefit.
Wonderful. And thank you all so much. I just love your last responses, because we went from a very hard, dark moment and then kind of found the light of engagement and people showing up in their communities and being engaged, and that there is hopefully a silver lining out there as long as we continue to talk to each other. So thank you so much to Psalm, Paul, and Ritu for talking to me today. We hope that all of you that joined us had a great time and maybe learned something, took a nugget of wisdom, and you share it with your own networks and your communities. We'll still be responding to any comments or questions on our Facebook or our YouTube channel. So keep sending those in if you have them, and we'll continue to be in engagement. Thank you so much for joining us. And until next time for Cabinet Conversations, I'm Teela Foxworth. Have a great rest of your week, everyone.